The midday sun beat down on the dusty street, and Anabia stood there, a woman caught between pride and survival. She hadn't eaten in days. The last of her coins had been spent on the small fire that kept the cold at bay last night, but there was nothing left for food. Her children had been gone for a long time now, and their graves were just a stone's throw away from the river. The wind seemed to whisper their names every time it passed, a cruel reminder of the life she had lost. The townspeople hadn't offered her a single hand, not even a scrap of work. A widow was bad luck, and a widow with 2 dead children? Well, that was a story no one wanted to hear. No one wanted to offer her a chance, let alone a job. As she stood on the corner, the harsh words of Mrs. Whitfield rang in her ears. "No one will hire you, Anabia. Not with that kind of past." She was too proud to beg, too proud to lower herself to the mercy of anyone. But pride didn't fill an empty stomach, and it didn't stop the cold from creeping in. The thought crossed her mind again. Could she endure another day of hunger and despair? Was it worth it to hold on to her dignity when she could see death's shadow waiting just around the corner? Anabia's thoughts were interrupted by a shadow falling across her. She looked up, startled. The man was tall, his face rough and weathered by years of labor, his gaze piercing. Jackson Whitfield, the rancher everyone whispered about, the man with the temper, the one whose wife had died mysteriously and whose daughter followed soon after. Some called it pneumonia. Others said it was something worse. Whatever it was, it had left Jackson a man of few words and fewer friends. No woman dared to work for him anymore, not after what happened to his last wife. Yet here he was, standing in front of Anabia, with a question that stopped her heart. "Can you sew?" he asked, his voice low but clear, like the calm before a storm. Before she could respond, Mrs. Whitfield appeared, her face contorted with judgment. "Don't listen to him, Anabia. That ranch is a graveyard for women. It will break you, just like it did to his last one." Anabia's heart pounded, her hands shaking. Mrs. Whitfield's warning stung, but it didn't change the fact that Anabia had nothing left to lose. Her mind raced. She had no food, no shelter, and no one left to turn to. Jackson's offer was a lifeline, even if it meant working under a man with a dark past. If she didn't take the chance, she would die slowly, bit by bit, on this street. She looked into Jackson's eyes. His stare was intense, but there was something behind it, something raw, like he too had known suffering and loss. For a brief moment, Anabia saw herself in him. 2 souls, both broken in their own way. A woman clinging to what little hope she had left, and a man who had buried his own dreams in the dirt. "I can sew," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Jackson nodded, his face unreadable. "Be at the ranch by sundown," he said, turning away before she could speak again. His back was stiff, his steps heavy as he walked toward his horse. As she watched him leave, Mrs. Whitfield's harsh words echoed in her mind. But for the first time in a long time, Anabia felt something stirring inside her, something other than fear. Hope, the possibility of a future that didn't end in silence and sorrow. What she didn't know was that Jackson had already asked 4 other women the same question. 4 women who had turned him down, afraid of the man, of the ranch, of the life that awaited them there. But Anabia was different. She was desperate enough, brave enough to say yes. And in that one word, she sealed her fate. The ride to the ranch was quiet, too quiet. Anabia sat on the back of Jackson's horse, her hands awkwardly hovering near his back, but never touching. She could feel the tension in his shoulders, a hard knot of discomfort beneath his worn shirt. It wasn't anger she sensed, it was something else. Shame, maybe, or grief. She couldn't quite place it, but it lingered in the air like the dust from the long ride. Jackson didn't say a word, and Anabia didn't try to break the silence. She had learned long ago that silence often said more than words ever could. The landscape around them was barren and dry, as though it had never known true life. When they reached the ranch, it loomed in front of them, a large, aging house that seemed to have forgotten the warmth of love and laughter. The porch was weathered, the windows dark, and the land around it was untended, stretching out in dry fields that seemed to reach forever. Jackson helped her off the horse, his hands gripping her waist a little too firmly, as if he was trying to steady himself more than her. He didn't look at her as he led her inside, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. The house smelled of dust and decay, and as Anabia stepped into the dimly lit entryway, she noticed the photographs that lined the walls. They were turned face down, every single one. On the mantel, the frame that should have held the picture of his wife was empty, and a child's toy, a small wooden horse, sat forgotten in a corner, its paint chipped and faded. The house wasn't just abandoned. It was a place that had been abandoned by life itself. Anabia could feel the sorrow hanging in the air, as thick and suffocating as the dust. Jackson didn't speak as he showed her to the small room where she would sleep. There were no warm welcomes, no kind gestures, only the silent acknowledgement that they both carried burdens far too heavy to be put into words. When he left her alone to settle in, Anabia wandered around the room, her fingers brushing over the threadbare quilts on the bed. She knew better than to unpack her things. This wasn't a place for hope, and she wasn't sure how long she would last here. That evening, Jackson returned with a pile of clothes in his arms, mostly dresses that must have belonged to his late wife. He dumped them on the bed without a word, his face hard as stone. "Fix these," he ordered, his voice barely audible. Anabia didn't ask questions. She knew what he meant. She knew he wasn't looking for perfection. He was just trying to keep his grief at bay, try to distract himself from the memories that those dresses must have stirred. Her hands trembled as she picked up the first dress, its fabric soft but worn. She could see the faint traces of where his wife had once worn it, the stitching barely holding it together. As she worked, she glanced over at Jackson, who stood by the door, his back to her. His hands were clenched in a fist at his sides, and every now and then she saw him stare at the ground, as if trying to push something down, something painful. She realized then that this was his way of grieving. It wasn't through tears or quiet reflection. It was through anger, through actions that made no sense to anyone else, through the constant drive to make things perfect. For the first week, Jackson tested her in ways that felt almost cruel. He'd throw a garment at her, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized her work. "These stitches are crooked," he would say, even when they were perfectly straight. He'd slam doors, storm out of the house, and return hours later with no apology. It was as if he was hoping she would leave, hoping that her patience would wear thin so he could send her away. But Anabia didn't leave. She couldn't. She knew too well what it was like to be abandoned by the world, to be cast aside like a useless object. So she endured. She redid the work he criticized, even when it didn't need to be done. She kept the fire going, even when it felt like there was no warmth left in the world. She kept the house clean, tending to the hearth and the table, making sure it felt like a home again, even if only for a moment. And slowly, she began to notice the small changes. The house was no longer completely silent. The kitchen smelled of food. Simple meals, but meals nonetheless. Jackson didn't say much, but he didn't leave anymore, either. He'd watch her from the doorway as she worked, his eyes softening ever so slightly. It wasn't much, but it was something. There was still a wall between them, a silent war being fought in the space they shared. But that wall began to crack piece by piece. It was a small thing, but one evening, Jackson's dog, his wife's dog, the one who had never trusted anyone since her death, came and sat at Anabia's feet as she worked. The dog had been distant, always keeping to itself, but now it laid down by her side, its head resting in her lap. Jackson stood in the doorway, his eyes narrowing as he saw the dog's choice. For a brief moment, he didn't move. He just stood there, staring, his face unreadable. And for the first time, Anabia saw a crack in his armor. It wasn't much, but it was something. Later that night, As the house grew still, Anabia hummed a lullaby, a song she used to sing to her children before they died. She hadn't even realized she was doing it until Jackson's voice, low and hoarse, interrupted her. "My wife used to sing that to our daughter," he said quietly. She stopped humming, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was something shared in that silence, something deep and aching that neither of them could put into words. Jackson didn't step forward, but he didn't leave either. For a moment, they were two people bound by grief, not strangers in a house of sorrow. But as the night wore on, Anabia could feel it, the shift. It wasn't a loud change. It wasn't anything grand or dramatic. But there was something happening between them. It was small, quiet, and tentative. But it was there, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The tension in the house was thick, and it came to a head one afternoon when Jackson stormed inside, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. He had been out on the ranch all day, his frustrations with the land, the livestock, and the never-ending battle with the world outside weighing on him. He slammed the door behind him and, without looking at Anabia, threw his shirt onto the table. "This damn land isn't worth a thing, and neither is anything I do," he shouted, his voice raw, cracking from the strain of too many months of bottled-up grief and rage. Anabia stood still, her hands frozen in the act of stirring a pot on the stove. She didn't flinch, didn't back away from his anger. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm but firm. "Anger comes from grief too heavy to carry alone," she said, her gaze steady on him. "I know. I carried mine after burying my children." For a moment, Jackson didn't respond. He stood there, staring at her, as if the words had stopped him in his tracks. He blinked, then lowered his head, his shoulders sagging under the weight of her understanding. The rage that had burned so hot in his chest began to cool, and when the silence stretched too long, Anabia calmly went back to what she was doing. The next morning, when she awoke, there was a pot of coffee waiting for her on the stove. Jackson had made it himself, though it wasn't as strong as she liked. But it was the gesture that mattered. That morning, as the two of them sat at the small table, Anabia noticed a subtle shift. He didn't apologize for the outburst the day before, but there was something in his eyes, something softer, more human. He wasn't just a man broken by loss. He was a man who was trying, in his own way, to heal. That small act of kindness, him making coffee for her, was enough to chip away at the wall between them, just a little. In the days that followed, the house began to change in more ways than one. Anabia woke to find a blanket on her bed, a heavy, woolen thing that looked like it had seen many years of use. It was lavender-scented, the faintest trace of a memory that Jackson couldn't seem to let go of. She folded it neatly every day, not out of obligation, but as a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken bond that was starting to form between them. Every day, the house felt a little more like a home. Jackson still didn't speak much, and there were days when he seemed to disappear into himself. But the little acts of kindness, like the coffee or the blanket, began to add up. Even when he didn't look at her directly, when his grief was still a wall between them, his actions spoke volumes. The meals Anabia prepared for him, though simple, became something he looked forward to. He never commented on the food, but she noticed that he cleaned his plate every time, something that seemed to mean more than mere satisfaction. One evening, after a particularly long day, Anabia hummed the lullaby she used to sing to her children as she worked by the hearth. It was soft, almost to herself, the kind of song that lingered in her memory like the smell of a loved one's perfume. She didn't even realize she was singing until Jackson's voice broke through the quiet. "My wife used to sing that to our daughter," he said, standing in the doorway, his voice thick with emotion. Anabia stopped, her heart skipping a beat, and she turned to face him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was the first time Jackson had ever shared anything about his past, and the first time she had felt truly seen by him. It wasn't a confession, not really, but it was an opening. The walls between them were beginning to crumble, slowly, quietly, but surely. That evening, as the night drew in and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, Jackson lingered in the doorway, watching her as she worked. He didn't speak, but his presence was no longer an intimidating force. It had become something else, something more familiar, more comfortable. She looked up from her sewing and caught his eye. And for the first time, she saw something there that wasn't anger or bitterness or sorrow. It was longing, a quiet, aching kind of longing, like he was searching for something, someone he wasn't sure he deserved to find. Jackson didn't come closer. He didn't need to. The space between them was filled with understanding, even if neither of them had the words for it yet. But the truth was undeniable. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just the house or the chores. It was them. The next few days passed with a strange quiet between them. Jackson still didn't speak much, but when he did, it was with a softness that hadn't been there before. They began to share small, intimate moments, not because they were forced, but because they couldn't help it. Anabia had learned to read his moods, to know when he needed space and when he needed someone to simply be there. And Jackson, in turn, seemed to be learning the same about her. One evening, as she sat on the porch, sewing in the fading light of the sunset, Jackson watched from the barn, his eyes tracing the curve of her back, the gentle rhythm of her hands as they moved with the needle. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. There was something in that moment, something so simple, yet so full of meaning, that spoke volumes. And for the first time, he admitted to himself what had been growing inside him for weeks now. He didn't want her to leave. He didn't want her to be a passing shadow in his life. He wanted her to stay. That realization came quietly, without fanfare, but it was as real as anything he had ever known. But he didn't speak it aloud, not yet. The truth, it seemed, was something they would both have to find, one small step at a time. The days had grown longer, and Anabia was starting to settle into the rhythm of life at the ranch. But the town's whispers still followed her like a shadow. One morning, as she walked to the well, Mrs. Whitfield and a group of other women were gathered there, exchanging words in hushed tones. As soon as Anabia approached, Mrs. Whitfield straightened, her eyes narrowing. "Some women are too desperate to care about dignity," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. The words stung, but Anabia's response was calm, a quiet strength in her voice that spoke louder than any sharp retort could. "I've buried 2 children and a husband. Your words can't touch me," she said, meeting Mrs. Whitfield's gaze with steady defiance. She turned and walked away, her back straight, not allowing herself to be swayed by the judgment that hung thick in the air. As she made her way back to the ranch, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the town's disapproval pressing down on her. It was clear they saw her as little more than a woman willing to sacrifice her dignity for survival. But what they didn't understand was that her dignity had been stripped away long ago, along with everything else. And yet, she didn't let their words break her. She had learned to fight in silence, to stand tall even when the world seemed set on pushing her down. That evening, as she went about her tasks in the kitchen, Jackson arrived from town, looking slightly unsettled. He had overheard everything at the mercantile, the gossip, the sneers, and Mrs. Whitfield's cruel remarks. He had been watching her, silently, as she faced down the town's judgment with grace. His chest swelled with an unfamiliar feeling, pride. But it was the kind of pride that didn't want to be seen, didn't want to be acknowledged. So, instead, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He brought her wildflowers. They were nothing grand, just a few simple blooms he had picked on his way home. But the gesture was enough. He didn't say a word when he placed them on the table, and Anabia didn't ask him to. She simply whispered, "Thank you," her voice thick with emotion. She knew he was trying, in his own awkward way, to show that he cared, that he understood. But there was more between them than just this small act of kindness. Jackson had seen her strength, had witnessed the quiet dignity with which she carried her grief and her burdens. He admired her for it, though he didn't know how to say it. The next few days brought more of the same, small, everyday moments that spoke louder than words ever could. But the storm that had been building for weeks finally came one evening when the skies darkened and the wind began to howl. The ranch, with its quiet isolation, seemed to feel the storm's full force. Jackson, caught in the middle of securing the barn, fought with the shutters as rain pelted down, soaking him to the bone. He finally made his way inside, dripping wet and covered in mud. Anabia, already by the hearth, was trying to coax a fire back to life, her face illuminated by the flickering light. Jackson stood in the doorway for a moment, his eyes lingering on her. "Storms don't last," she said softly, though her voice was tinged with something heavier. "No," he replied, stepping closer, shaking the rain from his coat. "But land changes after." It was a simple statement, but it was true. The storms they had both weathered, the storms of loss and grief, of isolation and silence, had changed them both. They had forced them to confront the rawness of their emotions, the pain they had buried so deep within themselves. But as the storm raged outside, the small house began to feel like a shelter from the world. Jackson, though exhausted and soaked through, sank into a chair by the fire, his gaze flicking to Anabia every now and then. She didn't look at him, but she could feel the weight of his presence, the shift in the air between them. He wasn't just a man caught in a storm anymore. He was someone who had begun to let go of the bitterness and the fear that had once held him captive. Later, Jackson disappeared for a while, and when he returned, he had something in his hands, a shawl, lavender-scented and soft, the kind of thing his mother used to wear. Without a word, he placed it gently on her chair, the gesture speaking volumes. Anabia's breath caught in her throat as she looked at the shawl. She had never expected something like this from him, something so delicate, so personal. Her eyes filled with tears, the floodgates opening for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch. She didn't know why she cried. Maybe it was because of the memory of her own mother, or maybe it was because, in that moment, she realized just how much Jackson had quietly given her. He hadn't said a word, but in his silence, he had given her something more than she could have asked for. The acknowledgement of her pain, the recognition that she wasn't alone in her grief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jackson stood frozen, unsure of what to do, but he didn't step forward. He didn't need to. There were no words needed now. The moment stretched out, heavy and full, before Mrs. Whitfield arrived at the door, her knock sharp and urgent, cutting through the quiet. She wasn't alone. There were two men with her, the preacher among them, and they were here for a reason. "We've come for the girl," Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice harsh and accusing, "to protect her from the impropriety of living under this roof." The words stung, and Anabia's heart raced. She hadn't expected the town to go this far, but there was no mistaking their intention. Jackson's face hardened, his body going still. He walked to the door, blocking it with his body, his voice cold and resolute. "She's under my roof, under my protection," he said firmly, his voice unwavering. But Mrs. Whitfield wasn't done. "And that's the problem," she spat, her eyes flashing with disdain. "We're here to make sure she doesn't ruin what's left of her reputation." The confrontation at the door was only the beginning. Jackson knew that their decision would soon be forced to a head. The choice they both faced, whether to stand together or fall apart, was coming, and it would change everything. The air outside was thick with the weight of the storm, but inside the house, it felt as though another kind of tension was brewing, one that had been building ever since Mrs. Whitfield's visit. The preacher, his face set in lines of judgment, stared at Jackson with unwavering eyes, his voice steady and full of authority. "You're living in sin, Jackson Whitfield," he said, the words cutting through the room like a blade. "And this woman," he gestured to Anabia, standing by the hearth, her face pale, "has no reputation left, no honor. You're both scandalizing the good name of this town." Anabia's chest tightened at the words, and for a moment, she thought she might break. But then she heard Jackson's voice, calm and firm, slicing through the preacher's accusations like a knife. "Then she has nothing left to lose by staying," Jackson said, his eyes locked on the preacher, his voice low and steady. He didn't shout, didn't raise his voice. He simply spoke the truth, as if it had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. "I don't care what the town thinks," he continued, his gaze flickering briefly to Anabia. "She's here by her own will, and she stays by her own will." The words hung in the air between them, a quiet declaration that nothing would make him turn away from her. Not now. Not ever. For a moment, no one spoke. The preacher's face twitched with anger, but he couldn't find a retort. Mrs. Whitfield stood rigid beside him, her mouth set in a thin, disapproving line. The two men with them looked uncertain, glancing between Jackson and the preacher, but neither of them dared to speak. Anabia stood still, her hands folded in front of her, her heart racing as she listened to the exchange. She could feel the weight of the preacher's condemnation on her shoulders, but she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. For the first time since her arrival at the ranch, she felt like she was standing tall, not just for herself, but for Jackson too. She wasn't a victim of their gossip anymore. She wasn't a woman to be pitied. She was strong, and she knew, deep down, that Jackson saw it too. The preacher hesitated, then turned to Anabia. "You will come to church on Sunday," he said, his voice still dripping with disapproval. "Both of you. Show the town that there's nothing untoward going on under this roof." Jackson met his gaze without flinching. "Fine," he said simply, his tone even. "We'll be there." As the preacher and Mrs. Whitfield left, their mission unfulfilled, Jackson shut the door behind them with a quiet finality. The storm outside had begun to wane, but the emotional storm inside the house still churned. The silence that followed felt suffocating, as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Jackson turned to Anabia, his expression unreadable, and she saw the flicker of something in his eyes, something deeper than just frustration or anger. It was uncertainty, perhaps fear. The man who had seemed so solid, so sure of himself, was now standing on the precipice of something he wasn't sure he could control. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. "Why did you say yes that first day?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as though the question had been gnawing at him since the moment they'd met. Anabia looked at him, her heart tightening in her chest. She had wondered the same thing herself. Why had she said yes? Why had she chosen this? In that moment, she realized that the answer wasn't just for him. It was for her too. "Because I saw myself in your eyes," she said quietly, her voice trembling just slightly. "I saw someone drowning in grief, just like me. I thought too, drowning people could keep each other afloat." There was a long pause as Jackson absorbed her words, and for a moment, the house was filled with nothing but the sound of the wind outside. The storm, the accusations, the judgment, all of it seemed so far away, so small, in the face of the raw truth she had just shared. Jackson took a deep breath, his eyes closing for a moment as if to steady himself. When he opened them again, he met her gaze, and for the first time since they had met, Anabia saw something vulnerable in his eyes, something that wasn't hidden behind the walls he had built around himself. "I blame myself," he said, his voice thick with the weight of years of grief. "My wife died of pneumonia. I called the doctor too late. And then my daughter, she died 3 days later. I should have done more. I could have saved them." Anabia's heart ached as she listened to him. She had always known there was something behind his distance, behind the coldness. But hearing it spoken aloud was another thing entirely. The depth of his guilt, his self-blame, was crushing. "I blame myself too," Anabia said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fever took my babies while I was gathering medicine. I couldn't get back in time." The tears she had been holding back finally came, falling silently down her cheeks as she spoke. "But we can't carry the blame forever. It'll crush us. Jackson was silent, his eyes fixed on her as she spoke, his chest rising and falling with each breath. Then, finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible, trembling with emotion. "I'm afraid," he admitted, the words slipping from his lips with a rawness he hadn't allowed himself to express in years. "Afraid of needing you. Afraid of losing you too." Anabia reached out, her hand gently touching his arm, offering him the comfort he had never allowed himself to seek. "I'm afraid too," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "But being afraid together might save us both." The words hung in the air between them, and for the first time, it felt like something had shifted, not just between them, but within both of them. There were no longer two people bound by their grief. They were two people choosing to move forward together. Jackson's tears came then, the first tears he had shed in 3 years. Anabia stayed by his side, offering him nothing but her presence, her understanding. And in that silence, in the rawness of their shared grief, something began to heal between them. The ghosts that had haunted them for so long began to fade, their whispers growing quieter, until they were nothing more than distant echoes. But even as they held each other, there was an unspoken truth between them. Sunday was coming, and with it, the choice that would define their future. Would they face the world together, or would the weight of their past tear them apart? The sun rose on a Sunday morning, casting its golden light over the ranch as Jackson and Anabia stood together, preparing to face the town. It was a quiet, tense moment between them, the weight of the decision they had made hanging in the air. Anabia adjusted the simple dress she had borrowed, the lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, and Jackson, in his best suit, stood beside her, his hand resting on the brim of his hat. The house felt different today, heavier, somehow, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for the judgment that was sure to come. The town would be watching, waiting for them to make a choice, to prove to them that there was nothing untoward going on. The preacher's words from the previous evening echoed in her mind, but she didn't let them sway her. She had nothing to hide, and for once, neither did Jackson. As they made their way to the church, the streets were eerily quiet. People peeked out from behind windows, gossip swirling behind closed doors. They were both aware of the stares, the whispered judgments that followed them, but neither of them spoke about it. They didn't need to. Anabia could feel Jackson's presence beside her, steady and strong, even if he didn't say a word. When they arrived at the church, the silence that greeted them was almost palpable. The congregation had already gathered, and as they entered, a collective hush fell over the room. Whispers rippled through the pews, eyes following them as they walked down the aisle. Anabia's heart beat in her chest, but she didn't let the discomfort show. She walked with her head held high, Jackson by her side, his eyes straight ahead. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had walked into this town with nothing but grief and desperation. Now, here she was, standing beside the man who had changed everything, ready to face whatever came next. The preacher, though still visibly disapproving, nodded curtly to them both. He began his sermon, the words flowing from him in the same monotonous tone he always used, but today they seemed to fall on deaf ears. Anabia wasn't listening. Her mind was on Jackson, on the choice they had made together, and the life they were about to begin. As the service drew to a close, the preacher's voice boomed over the congregation, asking if anyone had any objections. The words hung in the air, but no one spoke. The townspeople were silent, and Anabia could feel their eyes on her, their judgment thick in the room. But she didn't flinch. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let anyone tear her down now. Jackson, standing beside her, took her hand in his. The touch was simple, but it was a declaration in itself. There was no fear in his grip, no hesitation, just the steady, unwavering certainty that he had chosen her, and that she had chosen him. After a long moment, the preacher turned to Jackson and asked the question that everyone had been waiting for. "Do you, Jackson Whitfield, take Anabia to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in good times and bad, in sickness and health, until death do you part. Jackson's voice was steady as he answered, I do. I promise to be worthy of your strength. The words rang out in the church, and Anabia's heart swelled with something she couldn't quite explain. There had been so much pain between them, so much grief. But now, standing in front of the congregation, with Jackson's words echoing in her ears, she realized that they had come through it all, together. Then it was her turn. The preacher turned to Anabia, and she took a deep breath before answering. Do you, Anabia, take Jackson Whitfield to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in good times and bad, in sickness and health, until death do you part? Anabia's voice was soft but unwavering. I do. I promise to see you, even when you can't see yourself. It wasn't just a vow. It was a promise to him and to herself that no matter what came next, they would face it together. And with that, the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. The church was still, the air thick with anticipation, until finally, Jackson took a step toward her. He reached out and cupped her face gently in his hands, his touch tender and reverent. For a moment, everything else fell away. There was no town, no preacher, no gossip. Just the two of them standing in the quiet of the church, bound by their shared grief and the hope that had brought them to this moment. Slowly, Jackson leaned down and kissed her, softly at first, as if asking for permission. But when she kissed him back, it deepened, a promise that neither of them had ever dared to make before. The kiss was not just a union of their bodies. It was a joining of their souls, a symbol of all the pain they had overcome and all the love they had yet to discover. The congregation, still holding its breath, finally erupted in applause, but it was distant, muffled, as if it came from a place far away. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that they were here, together, and nothing else could take that away. The ceremony ended, but there was no time for celebration. Mrs. Whitfield, her face pinched with disapproval, was already waiting outside, ready to deliver her judgment. But Anabia didn't care anymore. Jackson's hand was in hers, and together they walked back to the ranch, leaving the town's whispers behind them. When they arrived, Elias, the ranch hand, had prepared a small celebration. Nothing fancy, just a quiet meal to mark the beginning of their new life together. The dog, who had become a silent companion to Anabia, wagged its tail, its joy simple and unspoken. The house, once cold and lifeless, felt full for the first time in a long while. As night fell and they sat together at the table, the weight of the day finally began to settle in. There were still questions, still fears, but there was something else too, a quiet hope that had begun to take root. The first night as husband and wife was awkward, a quiet understanding passing between them. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. They talked instead about their lost loved ones, about their pain, and for the first time, they shared their grief without judgment, without fear. They were no longer two separate people, alone in their mourning. They were together, and as they went to bed that night, in separate rooms, as they would for many nights to come, there was a quiet comfort in knowing that they no longer carried their burdens alone. The house no longer held just grief. It held something else, something new, something that, in time, might grow into something more. The days stretched on, weaving themselves into a tapestry of quiet routines that slowly transformed the once barren, hollow house into a place of life. The sound of sewing needles, the clink of dishes, the low murmur of voices, all of it began to fill the spaces between Jackson and Anabia. And in time, it felt less like mere existence and more like the kind of life she had once dared to imagine in her dreams. She woke each morning to the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the faint sound of Jackson tending to the animals outside. When he returned, he would always check on her work, though not in the critical, harsh manner he had before. Now, There was a quiet appreciation in his eyes, even when he didn't say a word. Slowly but surely, Anabia found herself working again, not just out of necessity, but because the house was beginning to feel like a home. She set up a small sewing space near the window, the light filtering through and casting a soft glow on her work. She made more than enough to cover their expenses, and in time, word spread through the town about the woman who had arrived at Jackson Whitfield's ranch and brought warmth, life, and dignity back into the house. Jackson, too, was changing. The ranch that had once been a symbol of his isolation and grief was beginning to prosper once more, but this time, it wasn't built on fear or the sharp sting of his temper. It was built on the quiet strength Anabia brought into every corner, on the respect she earned from the men who worked for him, and on the sense of fairness he had begun to develop. It wasn't a dramatic change, not something that happened overnight. But with each passing day, the ranch felt like something more than a place of ghosts and sorrow. It was a place where people could find a second chance, a fresh start. Anabia planted flowers around the house, bright splashes of color that seemed to breathe life into the land. She even started a small vegetable garden in the backyard, something Jackson had resisted at first, not believing that a garden could ever grow in the barren soil. But when he saw the first shoots of green poking through the dirt, a faint smile tugged at his lips. He didn't admit it aloud, but he was beginning to believe that things could grow again, even in a place that had once felt dead. The changes in the house were subtle at first, but as time passed, they grew undeniable. The mornings were quieter now, filled with shared moments, small exchanges of affection, quiet smiles, and the kind of intimacy that comes not from passion, but from something deeper, something earned through the shared weight of grief and survival. The silence that had once hung between them, thick and heavy, was now a comfortable thing. It wasn't just about making it through the day. It was about living again. And as Jackson worked beside her, side by side, he realized that he didn't just need her presence to fill the empty space of the house. He needed her in ways he hadn't known before. He didn't just need a cook, a seamstress, or a caretaker for the house. He needed someone who could see him, really see him, in ways that no one else had. Anabia had become that person, and as time went on, he began to admit to himself that he was falling in love with her. But it wasn't just her strength or her quiet dignity. It was the way she made him feel. She didn't need him to fix her, to save her. She simply needed him to be there, to stand beside her in a world that had given them both so little. It was that understanding, that deep, unspoken bond that had begun to weave them together in ways that neither had expected. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a soft shade of pink, Jackson sat beside Anabia on the porch, watching her work. She was sewing again, a steady rhythm to her movements as the light from the setting sun caught her hair, making it glow like fire. He watched her for a long time, his gaze softening as he saw the way she moved, the quiet grace she held, and something in his chest tightened. For the first time, he felt a kind of peace he hadn't known in years. She had become his quiet strength, the anchor he had needed, and in return, he had come to realize that he had become hers as well. He reached over, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't necessary. The weight of the years they had both carried was still there, but now it was shared. And for the first time in a long time, they both believed, really believed, that they could build something together, something strong enough to endure. It was on that evening, with the sky painted in hues of purple and gold, that Jackson leaned over and kissed her, the kiss soft and slow, full of the promise of everything that was yet to come. It wasn't a passionate kiss, but it was one that spoke volumes. He had waited for years to find something worth holding on to, and now, for the first time, he was certain that he had found it. "I'm falling in love with you," he whispered against her lips. "I already fell," she replied, her voice steady, yet filled with emotion. And in that moment, everything felt right. It wasn't just the words they spoke. It was the years of pain, the months of quiet understanding, the long days of building something from nothing. It was a new beginning, one they had fought for and earned. The shift in their relationship had been slow and steady, but now it was undeniable. They weren't just surviving together, they were living. And living for the first time felt like a gift. But life, as it always does, had a way of bringing things full circle. Not long after Jackson's confession, a young woman arrived in town, her face drawn with exhaustion, her eyes haunted with desperation. She was a widow, barely older than Anabia had been when she first arrived at the ranch, and she had two small children in tow. She had come to town in search of work, but no one would offer her a job. She was just like Anabia had been, with nothing left but the remnants of a broken life. When Anabia saw her, she felt the pull of recognition deep in her chest. She knew exactly what it felt like to have nothing, to be reduced to nothing but the will to survive. And so, she did what she had hoped someone would do for her. She approached Jackson, her eyes steady as she spoke. "She needs work," Anabia said simply. Jackson didn't hesitate. "Can she sew?" he asked, his voice soft but purposeful. Anabia nodded. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice firm. "She needs hope, and she deserves a chance." Jackson was silent for a moment, his eyes meeting hers as if searching for something in her face. And then, without a word, he went to the woman, his voice kind as he asked, "Can you cook? Clean? Anything?" She nodded, her hands trembling. "Come to the ranch," he said softly. "My wife needs help." And so, the cycle began again. Anabia welcomed the woman into their home, offering her the same chance she had been given. They worked together, side by side, and in time, the woman found the same strength that Anabia had. As the days passed, the house became a place of refuge not just for Jackson and Anabia, but for others who needed a second chance, just as they had. The house, once a place of grief, now stood as a symbol of hope, of healing, and of the quiet strength that could grow from the deepest wounds. One evening, Anabia stood at the graves of her children, her hand resting gently on the stone. She had planted flowers there, just as she had around the house, and the blooms swayed gently in the breeze. Jackson stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, and for the first time, there was no weight of grief hanging between them. There was only peace. "They'd be proud of who you've become," Jackson said softly. "Who we've become," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. Grief would always be a part of their lives, but it no longer defined them. They had found something stronger in each other, a love that had been forged in the fire of their pain and had emerged not as something to be fixed, but as something that could heal. Later that evening, as the sun set and they sat on the porch, Jackson took her hand in his. "Do you ever regret asking me that question?" she asked softly. His gaze softened as he turned to her. "My life didn't change. It started." And in that moment, Anabia knew it was true. The question that had been asked so many months ago had not just changed their lives. It had given them a chance to begin again. "Sometimes the right question is a door opening," she said quietly. Anabia came with nothing. No hope, no future, Jackson added, his voice steady. "I offered work, but really I asked, do you have the strength to keep going?" She nodded. "When I said yes, I asked you the same without words." They sat together in the fading light, the sound of the dog barking in the distance. Their story proves broken doesn't mean finished, Anabia said, her voice full of quiet certainty. The strongest foundations are built on honest, shared struggle. As the sky darkened and the stars appeared above them, Jackson turned to her, his eyes soft. "So here's my question for you, listener," Anabia said, addressing the unseen audience. "When life strips you down, would you have the courage to say yes? To keep stitching when the thread runs out? If this touched you, share your story in the comments. Tell me, where are you listening from? Have you had someone ask the right question at the right time?" She smiled softly, looking up at Jackson. The question was, "Can you sew?" The answer was, "Yes, and I can survive, endure, hope, and love again. Sometimes that's all we need. The right question and the courage to answer truthfully. Thank you for listening. Now, go find your question.